What were we fearful of in the Cold War? We were fearful of bombers that dropped gravity bombs. That's not the threat anymore. So, things that are going slower, like the speed of wind, or things that are going a lot faster, like a hypersonic glide vehicle, those behave differently. We can see things, but certainly the way we process them and talk about them is going to have to change.
Hey, everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today, I'm speaking with Lieutenant General David Nahom, former commander of Alaska NORAD Region, Alaska Command, and 11th Air Force. And before that, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff, Plans and Programs for the Air Force, also known as the Air Force A8. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks. Great to be here with you guys.
Yeah, so this is fun. Abu and I, Abu's his call sign, so we go back a ways. But a unique time in our Air Force, a unique time in our military, and with Abu's perspective, this will be a fun conversation. And so to start off, and I'm sorry to call you Abu, I should call you Sir General Nahom, but I'm going to stick with Abu. So obviously his background, so F-22 Raptor command pilot, led 21,000 folks in the Alaskan Defense Ops, 36-year military career. What are some of the most valuable leadership lessons you've learned over that time?
Yeah, I guess 36 years, you learn a lot. I think the big one I probably learned the most, having been a numbered Air Force commander, and then watching squadron commanders underneath you react it goes back to the 90s when you and I first started flying. And I think because I saw some bad examples throughout my early time in the Air Force of just squadron commanders who really didn't set a good example. And so that always stuck with me, that the number one part of leadership is you first got to set a good example for those under you. And one of the number one things is for a fighter squadron, as you know, if you're the boss of a fighter squadron, I expect you as the boss of a fighter squadron to be leading the first formation out the door on night one of a war. And if you are not that person, then you're in the wrong line of work. And everyone underneath you needs to understand that you're leading the first formation out the door, and you have what it takes to actually to do that and do it successfully. And I think that kind of sets the tone for the units. And I think that's just something I learned from something negative very early on in my career.
Yeah, so having that expertise to be able to lead from front, not just preach about it, but have no expertise around it.
Yeah. And just, you live your life the way you want the people underneath you to live your life. And if you're not happy with the behavior of those underneath you, sometimes you got to look at yourself.
Did you find yourself having to have that tough conversation with commanders? Because you weren't necessarily, maybe you were placing the commanders. So the commanders you put in were fine. But prior to that.
Absolutely. It was part of my indoc that I expect them. And if they can't see themselves leading on night one and they're not comfortable, then they're not the right person for it. So I had some very, very tough conversations along the way about that.
And how were the commanders? I mean, we've gone through a lot in the Air Force, a lot of changes, even from the time I retired. The culture's changed a little bit. There's been a lot of back and forth. What was the quality of the leadership that you saw coming up through the squadron commander rank?
I think it's incredible. We in the Air Force do not have a problem finding good commanders. We find they're just unbelievable. We have a huge problem keeping good commanders in after command.
What do you mean by that?
Very often, a lot of my squadron commanders, after a very successful squadron commander tour, they're right around 20 years, and they go on and do other things. And what
do you think is driving that?
There's so much that the family stuff is tough. We're doing a lot of things smarter. I remember when I came out of squadron command, my family went on about 4 or 5 moves in a row. And it was very tough on the family. And I know that, you see a lot of these young commanders coming up. Many are getting married later in life. That's just a trend that I saw in the Air Force. Many are having kids later in life. When you get to that point, you got young kids in schools. They see post-squadron command at a time that's going to be very tumultuous, a lot of moves, a lot of different career opportunities. And they have an opportunity to get out at that point. And many are taking it. So I think there's things we can do as leaders in the Air Force to soften that a little bit and keep some of the really good ones in, because they are really, really good. We recruit really well and we develop them really well. We just when we get to 20 years, we don't retain them very well.
Well, it's good to hear that we've still got the talent out there. How about, one of the best jobs, I think that you've had and I had is commanding a fighter squadron. How did that shape your approach to solving, defense challenges, complex situations?
I think you and I both have the same experience commanding. I think if some older people are listening to this, they commanded back in the 80s and 90s when they had maintenance and a lot bigger squadrons with a lot more. That's not the experience you and I had when, as a squadron commander, you just don't have much So you have to build relationships and build a lot of almost like coalitions to get things done. And you learn early that getting along is part of your job jar, is figuring out how you're going to figure things out with a maintenance commander who doesn't work for you, how you're going to figure out with the intel commander who doesn't work for you. Then as a fighter guy, some of the other support, the tankers, the AWACS, the other support folks that you need to get things done in a mission, no one works for you. And they all can vote and say no. And so you figure out how to get things done by making the relationships that you need. And I think that's something that's carried on throughout my career.
Yeah, they need to factor in wing command as well, where you don't, the different wing command models, or you don't own the base necessarily. So yeah, that's good. Well, let's shift then to your last job, NORAD in the Arctic. Given your time leading, Alaska NORAD, 11th Air Force. Lots of folks don't understand the importance of the Arctic. Can you share a little bit about the strategic importance of that, especially in, the new geopolitical kind of environment that seems to be shaping up right now and has been in existence? Maybe we're just differently aware or attuned to it.
Yeah, I think if you came to my office up in Alaska, the map I had under the glass was not the map that most Americans look at, with a flat map of the U.S. in the middle and Europe on the right and Asia on the left. My map, the center of the map was at the North Pole. And the world looks a lot differently if you look at it from the top screw on the globe. And in fact, if for anyone who hops on an airplane in Washington D.C. or anywhere in the States, Denver, you name it, and you go to Asia, that route of flight takes you right over the top of Alaska. That is the shortest direction from parts of some folks that don't like us or are certainly our competitors. If you think China and Russia, the easternmost portions of Russia, certainly North Korea, any kind of attack on the homeland is likely coming over the Arctic and coming over Alaska and through Canada. Which is why, if you look at how we defend the nation, right just south of you is in Colorado Springs, the NORAD headquarters. The North American Region Air Defense, and it's commanded by a U.S. 4-star with a Canadian 3-star deputy. We're in this with the Canadians, and that part I don't think people get how important geography is and how U.S. security and Canadian security are absolutely linked. I think the big thing, as we look at how we're set up, we set ourselves up in the Cold War. And threats have changed and are continuing to change. And when we look at, when I love the conversation the president and the administration is having about they're calling it the Golden Dome now, the Iron Dome for America, using what they have in Israel, the Iron Dome air defense system. It really starts with domain awareness. And I obviously don't want to get in front of the NORAD commander, General Guido, who's a good friend, who was my boss in my last job, but the domain awareness piece, how can we get our senior leaders, our national leaders, our president, the Canadian prime minister, to be able to see out further and sooner to any kind of attacks or any kind of threats emanating? And that's in all domains, whether that's in cyber, whether that's, small UAS, hyperglide weapons, threats from space. There's all kinds of potential future weapons that could be brought to bear on the U.S. and Canada. And we have got to figure out how we get the domain awareness so we can see threats out further and sooner. And that gets into the sensors and then how we manage the data. And that is a focus of NORAD, Northcom right now. And they're well on their way to designing that architecture. And I think this Golden Dome conversation it perfectly fits inside of that.
Yeah, it is interesting. And so we've had, General Van Herk, who was previous to that as Northcom commander. He's on a webinar coming up with us soon talking about a couple interesting topics. But, he mentions domain awareness all the time. You've continued that. During your time in command, correct? You had the threatening balloons float across.
Yeah, the balloon was. We laugh now, but if you look at the route the balloon flew, that's the route. It passed. It crossed the Aleutian Islands, hit Alaska right around the Seward Peninsula, cut Alaska at about the top third, floated into Canada, and then it was all kind of quiet. And then somebody looked up in Montana and saw a big thing in the sky. It was a large vehicle. To the point where, many, when this thing first hit Alaska, obviously, General Van Herk and I were on the phone constantly. Actually, I was on a trip. And so it was a crazy time. I was on a trip in northern Alaska in a village with very little comms. And we were in constant contact about what we were going to do about it. The problem was you had this large vehicle traversing the U.S. and Canada. up in 60 plus thousand feet, larger than a couple football fields. No one knows what it's going to do when you explode it and it starts floating down on the ground or crash it down on the ground, more likely. So there were a lot of conversations about what to do with that threat along the way. It was a very interesting time, but the route should, that is the route. That is the route.
So, I mean, people are shocked, but how did you find out about it, and how do we not see that?
We knew about it. We watched it before it even crossed onto the Seward Peninsula. We had F-35s on it, so we knew about it coming across. But it's slow moving. It's kind of doing its thing, and there is a is it threatening? Is it not threatening? That was the conversations, and you heard General Van Herk and a lot of this playing out in open press as well. The people that saying, well, you should have shot it down. And I go, well, what is something the size of a couple of football fields, a huge array, not just balloons. I mean, it was a lot of metal underneath that balloon. What's that going to do at 60,000 feet? And if it's your house below there, you may not want us to do that. And so there's a lot of questions. That's why the ultimate decision was made to wait till it got over water where you could do it safely, which they did.
When we had that, so was that a domain awareness issue? At some level, was it hard to track, hard to understand, or were you guys all over that one? Or is that the beginning of? There
is some issues when you're not, what were we fearful of in the Cold War? We were fearful of bombers that dropped gravity bombs. That's not the threat anymore. So things that are going slower, like the speed of wind, or things that are going a lot faster, like a hypersonic glide vehicle, those behave differently. We can see things, but certainly the way we process them and talk about them is going to have to change. And I think a lot of the domain awareness pieces, I tell you, we talk a lot about data, about the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, the Advanced Battle Management System within the Air Force, ABMS, and Project Convergence, and all these things that are really talking about the data piece. But it also comes down to the sensors. And if you look at what is going to see that thing that is going to threaten the U.S. And I'll tell you again, it goes to all domains too. Because it could be something very small, like a small UAS swarm or something along those lines too. And we've seen with what played out at Langley Air Force Base and certainly New Jersey, even if you have the means to shoot some of these things down, it gets into some authorities and some other things we have not grasped with as a nation yet when it comes to small UAS.
What are the things from the Arctic, from protecting that? You hear about like the ice cutter ships or icebreakers. I don't know what the exact term is. Like, what are some technologies and key enablers up there where we need to make some advancements?
I think there'll be a lot is going to be on orbit, and a lot is happening on orbit. Certainly, Starlink was a huge win for the Arctic. It opened up a lot of places in Alaska and other places around in the Arctic that struggled with comm communications in the past, and allowed us to communicate in ways we had not before. And have, I remember visiting a village in the northern Alaska slope, and we spent the whole day touring around. I finally got to my room. I sat down. The guy hands me the Wi-Fi password, and I log on my iPhone with the Wi-Fi password, and great broadband, and through Starlink. And I was, watching Sports Center, catching up on the scores from the day while I was relaxing before bed. That didn't happen before that. So there are some good advancements in communications, but they were I would say, just to start. One thing people got to realize with the Arctic is the climate is changing up there. And without getting into any of the political, who's causing it and all that, it's important to understand that the climate is changing, and that is changing the nature of the Arctic in terms of how we are going to have to behave in the future.
How are you seeing the change? Like, what is it like?
First of all, the sea ice is retreating, and that does a couple things. One thing is it exposed the coastline. So there's an absolutely accelerating coastal erosion in Alaska and the northern territories of Canada. I'm sure in Russia as well, but that wasn't my concern. There's infrastructure along the Alaska northern coast that's quite frankly falling into the ocean because of the accelerating coastal erosion. The permafrost is melting. Much of the infrastructure in Alaska and other countries was built on top of permafrost, which is, like the name, permanently frozen. Well, a lot of it ain't so permanently frozen anymore. If you run around Alaska to a lot of the bases I had up there, you see cracks in runways and buildings and infrastructure that weren't there before because of the thawing subterranean area. And that's going to take investment to fix that we have not put in place. The biggest thing, though, is it's opening up sea routes that are very lucrative. If you look at the northern sea route that the Russians opened up, you're talking about a 10-day to 14-day cut off of the transit from Japanese and Chinese ports into northern Russia and Europe. And so if you can cut that much time off transit and not have to go through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal and all these areas that are very difficult to transit, that is gigantic. And so this is because the sea ice is retreating. And so you're actually seeing more routes potentially opening up in the future. So this gets into icebreakers and all, but the issue is it's opportunity. The other thing with the sea ice retreating is it's opening up some areas of exploration that weren't there before: natural gas, rare earth minerals. It's opportunity. I used to tell people up there that came to visit us up in Alaska, this is opportunity. Unfortunately, opportunity brings competition. Competition brings crisis. And right now, if you look at the 8 Arctic nations, and to get into the Arctic Club, you got to have territory in the Arctic, and that's the U.S. is because the top third of Alaska is in the club. The good news on that, of the 8 Arctic nations, 7 of them are now in NATO, with Finland and Sweden assessing into the alliance. The bad part about that is the 8th nation is Russia, and they got about 40+% of the coastline up there. And a absolutely overwhelming amount of the investment in Arctic infrastructure is Russian. And then if you start looking at the numbers of icebreakers and et cetera, the Russians are much more established than the NATO nations up there. So we've got some work to do. And it's one of these places that, for the good of America and Canada, for the good of our security, we would benefit from the Arctic maintaining itself as a free and open common. And I would say that's going to be in jeopardy in the next decade or two with the changes up there.
Are you seeing either, before this administration or this administration, here topics, but as you look at the policies that are being rolled out, do you feel we're positioning ourselves appropriately for that? Or how does that change? Because for a while it was, whatever, and it's starting to shift.
I think all administrations have really talked about it. There's Arctic strategies. There's a U.S. Arctic strategy. There's a DoD. There's the Air Force and Navy. Everyone's got an Arctic strategy. The problem is they're thin. They're just not funded. And the things that we need to do in the Arctic are just not funded. And so I guess the jury's still out. The first Palm Program Objective Memorandum budget, essentially, for the DoD under the new administration hasn't been published yet. So I'm very hopeful because I do believe we have to establish ourselves, and I do believe the U.S. has to take some leadership up there too, because for U.S. and Canada, it is absolutely tied to our security with the changing nature of the threat, especially coming from China.
Absolutely. Well, using that as kind of a segue from a budget perspective, let's go to your time, as the A8 with that. I think something that's interesting that I'm not sure all folks know, Air Force has a pretty big budget. I won't even guess. I'm sure you can probably fill it in. It's split with a Department of Air Force. Then you have Air Force and Space underneath that. And you hear about cost-cutting measures. You got the DOGE out, different things. But really, how much of that budget, is fungible, or actually you can get to by making cuts, for example. A lot of people think, well, you got a huge budget, cut 50%, cut 20%, cut 10%. That's easy. How much really exists there? And talk to me a little bit about just the overall state of the budget and, our current infrastructure for Department of Air Force.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. The first thing is, you said that Department of Air Force's budget is split between the Air Force and Space Force. So there's a third entity, which they call the pass-through. It's an important thing that the DoD put the intelligence agencies inside the Air Force budget years ago.
I didn't know that.
It's a large chunk of money, and the Air Force has no control over it. The problem is when you look at the Air Force budget, everyone goes, that's huge. It's bigger than the Army. It's like the Navy's number one, which is the Navy and the Marine Corps together, than the Air Force. Well, when you actually parse out the pass-through, the Air Force falls behind the Army in most years. And every year I was up there. And so,
explain to me what a pass-through is. Or
they basically just they needed. There's a lot of history of how it got there, but the bottom line is many of the agencies' money just gets budgeted through the Air Force. So it looks like Air Force, but actually the Air Force has no control. It just comes in and goes out.
So you're saying like NSA is funded out of the Air Force? Or
not so much that, and NRO and others are
okay.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing is that the pass-through budget is bigger than the Space Force's budget. And so so that part for years, the Air Force has been trying to get the pass through out of our budget just so people can actually see what it is. And there's just been no interest from Congress to do that. So it is what it is. It's there. You hear others, Mitchell Institute, and others talk about the pass through all the time, but it is. I believe it's problematic because it makes the Air Force look like, hey, you guys are wasting a bunch of money. Well, really, at the crux of your question is, if you look at what Chief Alvin, and certainly my successor, General Tabor, the A8, have to deal with right now, is that the Air Force, there's not a lot of flexibility. Every year the SecDef, really the DepSecDef, puts out what they call a DPG, a Defense Planning Guidance, that says this is where you're going to invest for your POM, your Program Objective Memorandum, your 5-year budget, essentially. And that's very prescriptive. Here's where you're going to put your money. And if you look at it, you're going to fund the nuclear enterprise. You're going to fund, and then you go CivPERS, your civilian personnel budget, MilPERS, all your bases, your weapon system sustainment account. When I left, that was gusting $20 billion a year because of our aging weapon systems. You start adding together everything that you have to invest in. Really, what the chief is left with is like single-digit percent. And not high single-digit percent of what really he can play around with. So when you say, okay, cut 8%, you're cutting a huge amount. And inside that single-digit percent, big programs live, like the F-35 and other things. So it makes it very, very tough when they say, we're going to ask you to cut 5%, 8%, 10%. There's really not many places to go. This gets into, when companies come in and they got a thing that we can use. And we all look at it as military people go, oh my God, we can absolutely use that. Well, they start with AFWERX and in the AFRL, the Air Force Research Labs, and they get into an AFWERX contract, SBIRS 1, maybe SBIRS 2, and there's some money there to kind of get started. Now, how do you get that into the Air Force program? Every year, I would have 100, 200, 300 of these things that were so incredible, and I may be going forward 3 or 4 of them to put into the budget because that's just where the budget was. And so you have to... and then I'll tell you, other things hit you at the end. You think you have it perfectly, and then gas prices go up. Well, the Air Force is the single largest user in government of fuel. Big airplanes take big gas. And so I got to budget more money for gas. And the SecDef comes out and said, we're going to give a raise to the troops. Right thing to do. Our youngest enlisted are woefully underpaid. But I'll tell you, that is big money. And so, the joke was when you're a programmer, when you're the A8, they go, you've truly become a good programmer when you hate your own pay raise and you watch your own weapon system, the F-15 go to the boneyard and you help it along. And unfortunately,
I don't like you for that, by the
way. So, there's extreme pressure on the chief on that. And there's just not enough money to do the things he wants to do. The other one too, I'll tell you, one of the problems is I call it overlap. Because you bring a new system on, a new weapon system comes on, a vendor comes in, it's got this thing, but it's going to take people. Well, let's say it takes 500 people. Where are you going to pull those people from? 500 people are doing something else right now that the combatant commanders are relying on. So, at what point do you stop? Do we pull people out of Korea? Do we pull people out of the Middle East? What do we stop doing so we can free up people to do this next thing, or free up the installation so we don't have to build a new installation, free up buildings so we don't have to build new buildings. That overlap piece was one. I found one of the hardest things to manage as the A8 is when we want to bring in a new capability. Where are you going to find the people? Where are you going to find the basing? Where are you going to find the facilities that are operable that you can use? The other one too, the chief and chiefs talk about it. The Air Force is very overprescribed on infrastructure right now. We have too much infrastructure and too many bases. The problem is it's very political. The only way to get rid of bases and infrastructure is a BRAC, the worst 4-letter word in DC, base realignment and closure. People in Congress do not like to see bases being reduced or closed in their districts. I had a hard enough time with a weapon system that was coming in, a modern weapon system that we're bringing into a base, replacing it one for one. And the local delegation was upset because we were actually reducing the number of people on the base, because the new weapon system only needed about a third as many people because it was modern and it just, that's, what it took. They were not happy about that. So these are the things that the headwinds that certainly the chief and the A8 have as we try to modernize the force.
Okay, let's put you in a hypothetical, totally unrealistic. You have no political blockers. You need to become more efficient, reduce the slop. There are things that I've heard you mention before. I'll bring it here. This may be part of it, but, how many air forces do we need? How many space organizations do we need? Different things like that. If you were to, let's just focus on the Air Force, but it can tie into how would you, reduce cost and make the efficiency of every dollar spent to accomplish the Air Force mission effective?
One of the ways you do it is demand. And it sounds really, you've got to find a way to give a relief of, you can't, I'll use the AWACS, a perfect example. I mean, the AWACS, we should replace that thing 10 years ago. That airplane's falling apart. It doesn't have the maintainability or, quite frankly, the capability for modern threats. But we were hanging on to it, hoping there was something bigger coming along that was not a flying platform. And there are some things bigger coming along. The problem is the AWACS is not going to be able to meet it. So now we're buying the E7 Wedgetail, but we're buying it too late. The first E7s are going to be in the line probably long after most of the AWACS is already in the boneyard, just because we just have a maintainability problem with that platform. If you can get rid of some of the demand and you can actually reduce the existing capability sooner, it actually allows you in budgets to modernize. We were able to do this with some individual fighter units where we said, okay, this one, and actually we did it with guard units, by the way, because it was easy. It was cleaner with a guard unit where you go, okay, you're going from F-16s to F-35s. Instead of doing this thing, you fly F-16s right up to the point where the F-35s are combat capability. Like, no, all the F-16s are going away, either the boneyard or other units. We're going to spend 3 years redoing the facilities, retraining the people, bringing in the new airplanes, getting them ready. And from the day we start transition to the day we finish transition your combat capability, you got 3 years. Everyone stays employed, all that. It was unbelievable how successful that was. The problem is we can't find places to do. It's very hard to find places to do that because, as soon as you do that, I mean, the fight we went through with Kadena with the F-15C, yet the C model is going away before the EXs show up there. I remember a conversation I had with people inside the CJCS staff. They're like, well, how many F-15s at Kadena are truly past their service life? I go, well, that's easy. All of them. In fact, at the time when we made the decision to do that, the youngest airplane was 1,000 hours past service life. And how much are you going to fly these airplanes? But we weren't going to let us take those airplanes off the air patch until the new ones showed up. Well, we don't have the people for that. We don't have the facilities. So now we have to build new facilities for the overlap. Well, we don't have the money for that either. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, this is what we have to solve, is we have to figure out how to reduce the demand on certain parts of the Air Force so we can take the pressure off to modernize. That's how I think we actually do this.
Okay, let's pull that thread. How do you reduce demand? I mean, obviously that's not a UAA Air Force problem. Might have been your issue when you were NORAD. How do you reduce the demand? Is it
you've got to take advantage of not only other aspects of the Air Force, but other services and frankly other countries too. Maybe a capability that we have that we need to modernize. One of our Five Eyes partners, the Brits, the Aussies do. Maybe we can work with them to do that for a year or two. We've done it for them, by the way, in the Middle East and for many countries when they were modernizing and they left and they came back and we deployed extra units. When I was a DC FAC and the deputy for Air Forces Central in the Middle East in 2018, we had several countries that were modernizing, and we actually deployed more American air power into the Middle East to backfill them as they retreat. So I've seen us do this for other countries. How could we actually work that out for them to do it for us too? Or the Navy's got surveillance planes in the case of the AWACS, the E-2D. There's ways you can do this. They're not easy, but the problem is if you don't do it, you end up waiting too long and you wait too late, and then you have a huge problem like we have with the AWACS right now.
Yeah, and that seems to go across the board. So, I mean, that's capability, relying on international partners who haven't, or they've seen, really made their fair share investment to different conflicts where we're overreaching. I mean, that's a political issue that somewhat is probably being addressed. Unless you have thoughts on that, but
yeah, we had a big fight over the A-10, which was a good one too. But it goes back to I got it. The A-10 may be better at CAS than the F-35, but the same humans that are fixing and flying A-10s, we need to fix and fly F-35s. So we either keep A-10s and stop buying F-35s, or buy F-35s and send the A-10s to the boneyard at some point. That there's a finite number of humans in the Air Force, and in budgeting math, If the chief came to me with a program and said, I want to add this program, it's going to add 2,000 people to the Air Force. Well, you have 300 and something thousand people. What's 2,000? Well, for every 1,000 people I would add into the Air Force, I would have to budget for about a $500 million would be for FIDEP. So about $100 million a year. People are expensive. And so and then once you budget the spaces, you got to find the faces. You actually have to go out and recruit to those new missions and actually increase the size of the force. And that's not as easy as it used to be either.
So political agendas aside, how's the biggest way you could cut significant cost out of the Air Force? Is it bracking?
You're going to have to at some point reduce some infrastructure. There's probably some bases. There's certainly some bases, missions that are duplicated in certain areas. There's certainly things you have to do. I believe there's headquarters too. There's some, when you look at the fighter force, if you look at a 2,000 fighter force that we have right now, the most efficient way to manage a fighter force is about between 2 and 4 squadrons per wing. If you do that, you end up with somewhere between 20 and 25 wing headquarters of fighters. We have 48 in the Air Force. We actually have to, now some of those are guard, but small, so there would have to be some discussion about how you do that. But I certainly see there could be some reduction of headquarters and the way we actually manage our forces too. Those will be very difficult discussions because headquarters are in districts too, and those are real hard conversations with Congress as well.
Politics.
I understand it. I've around long enough. I get it. And Congress, most of the time, the conversations with Congress are very helpful. They kind of, it's not, no, you can't, is okay. If you want to, this is what you want to do, here's how you have to do it. And very often that's the way the conversations go. And so, they're part of the process, they're partners, and we have to work with them. And that's why when I was the 8, I spent a lot of time at Capitol Hill. And trying to figure out how, and not no, but yes, but, and figure out how ways we get things done.
So we talk a lot about AI, autonomous capabilities, and if we just look broadly, holistically at the problem from subs to surface to automated ground vehicles to automated airplanes, the different platforms that are coming out for the Air Force. They just announced the F-47, the ability to go family of systems, next generation air dominance with unmanned. What is your take on, this surge of appetite for unmanned autonomous vehicles?
I think obviously the appetite is there, and it's been growing over the years, and that crosses all administrations, and the idea of the ability to fly unmanned. There are some huge advantages. When you actually take a vehicle and you take the life support systems out of it, and you take crew rest and other things like that out of the equation, it's pretty amazing. Now there are some ways we did unmanned in the past where it wasn't really unmanned. It just happened to be there was no person in the vehicle, but we had 20 or 30 people watching one vehicle from the ground. There's new ways to automate that and do that better. And I think we're heading towards that with certainly the CCA conversation. I think there's some other opportunities with unmanned too. I mean, we all want to talk about the kill chain and talk about what the collaborative combat aircraft, the CCA, in concert with manned platforms, manned-unmanned teaming, things we could do in the high-end fight to close kill chains. But there's also lower-end stuff that I can see, and certainly in logistics and how we move things around. I mean, one of the hardest problems we have to solve in the South China Sea, that in 11th Air Force, I had most of the small locations around the Pacific, Wake Island and Shinya Island and all the surrounding islands around Guam and the CNMI. One of the hardest things you do is move things, probably specifically fuel and munitions. And many times when you move them, you're like, I don't need that to be a manned platform to move fuel and munitions from point A to point B, whether it's on the surface, subsurface, or in the air. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. The UAS, obviously, we had talked about the offensive. You hear a lot of that in the press right now about what's going on in Ukraine. And certainly there's something to be told there. But also the defensive side, the counter small UAS, that is a huge problem in the Pacific, just like it is anywhere else in the world right now. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for companies in that space, especially in some of these locations that are real far away from everything. There's still a persistent UAS problem in some of these places. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. The other one too is in the Arctic too. If you think about, if I got to get something in the air for surveillance. Right now, we launch at AWACS, and every time we launch an AWACS, it's a 1970s era 707. It's half a heart attack sometimes getting it airborne. What if there was an uncrewed system that could do some of the, maybe not all the command and control that an AWACS can do. Certainly the professionals on board that airplane are amazing, but the surveillance piece of it, it could stay airborne 3, 4, 5 times as long without putting a body at risk, especially with some of the extreme weather and some of the things we fight in the Arctic. There are some companies that are in that space, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to integrate into some kind of a domain awareness system. If you look at uncrewed systems in the Arctic.
So from a perspective of the changing nature of warfare with the drones, what's the best lesson we could learn from Ukraine and Israel conflict and, Gaza? And what's the lesson we should not be learning from that?
I think I'll start with what we shouldn't learn too, is that geography matters. The geography of the Ukraine fight, the geography of the Israeli fight are very, very different than the geography of the South China Sea. When you start looking at the distances that you're going to travel from one piece of land to another piece of land, suddenly you start needing a lot of gas, and then you need the weapons, and then suddenly this thing that you thought was the size of the table that I got my computer on right now suddenly starts looking a lot larger, like the size of a traditional airplane. So I think geography really matters, and so we have to make sure that the lessons we learn in Ukraine, in Israel, may not translate to what I call in the South China Sea the ultimate away game, because it's not just an away game for us. If we've got to go into the South China Sea to secure objectives and do something that our nation asks us to do, it is not close to anything, and it's going to be really, really tough being that far from home, that far from our logistics lines, and some of the lessons, some of the things you see in the Middle East in general, in Israel specifically, just wouldn't be applicable. That said, you're certainly seeing one thing I've been amazed at, some of the commercial off the shelf things that were never built with military in mind and how effective they can be. And so I think there's something to learn. I look at these small companies, and one thing is that we've got to get away from, and I think we're doing a much better job in the Air Force anyway, of, hey, I got this problem. Here's my COAs. Here's my solution. Okay, Company X, go build me this. We got to be much more, okay, here's my problem. Hey, Company X, why don't you come in here and help me solve this problem? Because they may already have something, or they may have some very unique ways that we're not even thinking about. And we in the military, we just don't have the core of the market on the ideas. And I think you're seeing, that's something I've certainly seen when I look peek behind the tent, what's going on in Ukraine, and certainly what's going on in Israel. Just very, very impressed with the technology and how they're bringing it to bear, and how some of these companies, some of the innovations are being brought quickly, really, really quickly to the battlefield. That's something certainly that is a lesson we can certainly learn here in the U.S.
Yes, and it gets a little bit into the cost symmetry in warfare.
You're right, Doug. If the enemy's coming at you with $1,000 thing, it gets really expensive if you're shooting back at it with a $500,000 thing. Which, if you look at the swarms we shot down over Syria that were heading for Israel with the F-15Es a couple months ago, it was just some pretty expensive missiles we were shooting at them. And so they work great. Don't get me wrong. The missile that shot the balloon down over South Carolina worked fantastically, but we can't do that all the time. We've got to get on the cost side of this thing. I do have in my house, because we had several other balloons that showed up in the Arctic. We took down a couple of them. We did try to take one down with a gun, and that was just purely because we thought we could. And it gets into, we've got to start learning about better ways to neutralize these threats. In this case, it was a very controlled way to do it, to see what actually work. It didn't, because of the ranges, it just didn't work. And they ended up having to use a missile. But these are things we are constantly thinking about. Are there cheaper and better ways to do it? Because if the enemy's going to come at you with a swarm, we're going to very quickly run out of very expensive, exquisite things. That's where the F-47 and all the NGAD rollout too is very interesting too, because that is an exquisite platform, and it's going to be a team of platforms that are built around each other, man-on-man teaming and all that. It's going to be fantastic what it can do in the future, and we're very, very excited about where it's going. But that's exquisite high end. That's not something that is probably going to be used in the Middle East to take down swarms of drones. That's not what it's designed for. It's designed for a very specific problem, the most difficult military problem we have. That's this ultimate away game in the South China Sea. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch when you look at that exquisite, there's going to be a lot of things that are not exquisite that we're still going to need. And we're going to need to figure out how to do them cheaper and better.
Yeah, definitely a challenge for the A8s coming up on how to fit that into the budget.
Yeah.
All right, so let's transition a little bit of, I love the primes, I love the Lockheeds, the Boeings, they have a place, but the small businesses, we see that's where the real innovation, happens, where the art of something didn't even know could happen is also some small companies doing that. We talked a little bit about it, but they get the SIBRs, they go the AFWORK thing, which, is great. They've got the bridging the valley of death is the big term. From your perspective, what needs to change to really accelerate that or help companies, that have great technologies, but they may not be needed in, 5 million copies of this thing, but it's really important to get to the warfighter. How do we accelerate that?
When you look at the SIBRs piece too, it's the AFWORKS and AFRL, the Air Force Research Lab, almost is incentivized to place these bets in these small companies. The idea is to see what's out there, and I think that process actually works pretty good. I think it's very, I don't want to say easy, but it's very open for a company to get in there and get some seed money to get started and show if there's some applicability to their technology. Getting from that point into the palm where you have a stabilized program is very hard. That's that valley of death. Because a company is going to have to stay along long enough to have the cash flow long enough to get to a program. I recently was talking to a company that actually is in the palm, but not till 28, and then they're not sure they have the cash flow to make it there, and so they're entering in that valley of death and how they get there. Now there are some new programs out there that OSD did introduce to help companies with that. And there are some opportunities out there. That said, though, I think if the company is spending their time with the service, I think they're probably not doing themselves any favors if they're only talking to the Air Force, only talking to the Army, only talking to the Navy. Because the services, like I said, go back to the budget conversation we just had. It's tough. You'll have 200-300 good ideas, and you can only afford 3 or 4. Which ones you pick? And so, really, the conversation has to be at some point with the warfighter. The combatant commands, the numbered air forces, the CFACs, the forward commanders, when they see this thing and they can see how it can actually change the nature of their fight, then they can put the pressure on. Also with OSD, certainly CAPE, the cost assessors, the comptroller, the R&E, the research and engineering. Many cases, there's other pots of money out there that can then be funneled into services. In the 8, when I was successful with getting some small innovation into the budget, it usually came when as the 8, I was partnering with one of the COCOMs. One of the COCOM J8s, the CENTCOM J8 or the NORTHCOM J8 would contact me, say, I got this thing, we got to get it in. How do we, and then we would partner, we would go together to some of the OSD agencies. We would work out to get extra money into the Air Force budget so we could specifically buy this thing, so that it could change. And we had a couple of examples where that actually worked, that partnership. But just sticking with the services is going to be very, very tough, just because they just don't have the flexibility.
Well, give me an example or two of one of your biggest successes, you think, where that strategy helped.
Well, it's interesting. OTHR was over the horizon radar. When I was even though that benefited me when I got up to 11th Air Force, it's something NORTHCOM wanted badly for the future of domain awareness. Interesting. There's some other technology that's coming down. We may have not doing that, but that's a whole side. I know. But the way we did it was the NORTHCOM J and I. We actually went to the OSD and we had it reclassified as a new technology, new capability. We brought on a different pot of money. We moved it into the Air Force, and then we funded that way. So we actually worked very closely and got that put into and it wasn't into the out years either. We got it put into the budget year, so we started it right away. So there are the other one was partnered with the SOCOM team to get the light attack aircraft. It's something SOCOM wanted. They wanted to have this autonomous light attack aircraft that they could park on dirt roads in the middle of Africa and other places around the world. We just didn't have the juice in the Air Force to start a new aircraft program. But working together, we were able to work the money and get that started. And that's just starting to produce now. And so there were some successes. Those were a little bigger than small innovation, but even with the small, there's some small ones in there as well. And some much smaller programs than that. But it very often as a service, I just didn't have the juice to do it just because there wasn't enough flexibility to move things in. Unless it's really, it was really small. Very often we could actually fit it in quietly. I say quietly, but we could just there was room to fit it in. But if it was a little bigger than that small, then it was very hard to do.
Where do you think what's the biggest technology enabler that you see, pretty immediate, ROI coming into the service that you're excited about?
I love the work that the Air Force is doing, the advanced battle management in the JADC2, the Joint All Domain Command and Control. I do like the work they're doing. I think they're getting at closing kill chains. We've got a lot of legacy hardware out there. We're going to be flying B-52s. I know we're modernizing them, but they're still B-52s, and KC-135s are going to fly past their 100th birthday as well, more than likely. We're building new F-15s right now, a 50-year-old design. We're going to have a lot of legacy out there. How do we sew it all together? And I do believe that's where the return on investment is. I've seen it too much when the exercises last year. I was in the South China Sea down watching my guys work. You'd see data coming off different platforms, and the only thing that glued them together was an airman sitting there on a keyboard, on a chat room, chatting from one side to the other. Essentially, there was no connection with the data, and you would see it like an aircraft would be coming back in from a mission. It was broken it needed a certain amount of spare parts, it needed certain technicians, but the airplane was programmed to go back to a base. Well, by the time they could process it and figure out that the base that the aircraft was going back to was the wrong base, because that's not where the spare parts or the technician they needed were. The airplane was already on the ground. So now we got to move the spare parts and the technician and it's not just drive down the road like it is in Europe. We actually got to take off, fly from one island to the next, get them the spare parts and the technicians. Had the data connected, we would have known that instantaneously, and we would have told that airplane not to go to base X, but to go to base Y, where they get fixed quickly and get back in the fight quickly. There were those kind of things. There's a lot of examples of that where when we can truly stitch this together, it's going to be unbelievable. I mean, game changing, unbelievable. The machines we have right now are good. If we can get the machines in the air with the right fuel and the right weapons, it's incredible. But how you stitch it all together to make sure that the machines are in the air with the right fuel and right weapons, that takes a lot of work, and that takes a lot of data from a lot of different entities that were never built together, never built to work together, and how we get them to work together. I think it's going to be where huge return on investment comes.
So let's transition a little bit to training. Training is a big part. How to get folks trained and readiness. We've gone through and you've seen it more extensively than I have. How has your perspective on readiness and training changed over time? And what would you say training companies and folks that are building, and there's a bunch of guests on here that, deal with training at some level. What's your perspective on that? Where is their opportunity?
The big word is predictability. It's an unpredictable world, and there's times we've got to launch right away and get airplanes in the fight. But most of the time we can be predictable. When airplanes are new, like F-35s right now, or the F-15s, when you and I first started flying them, they were still relatively new. You could fly the wheels off these things. Our Air Force right now, with a fleet average gusting 30 years old, is not that fleet. And the way you fix it is predictability. We can't go to every exercise. We can't go to every training event, but we got to go to some key ones. There's some we have to go to because it's important to an ally for us to be there. There's others that are really important for high-end training, like some of the events in Nellis and the surrounding areas down in Vegas. But we can't go to too many of them. We also got to give maintenance some good, long, predictable touch points so they can do proper scheduled maintenance, get after these airplanes so they're ready to go on day one. When I would fight to get predictability to my units at 11th Air Force, it was unbelievable. You would see the change almost overnight and how much better the airplanes got because you gave the maintenance to predictable touch points. The aviators were able to get after good, solid training programs to get their guys trained properly. And then when we actually go on an exercise, and we'd launch 12 F-22s, let's say, out of Alaska into Guam or somewhere. 12 would take off, 12 would get there, they'd complete the exercise, 12 would take off and come home. We wouldn't have broken airplanes strewn all over the place because, and it was unbelievable, the change. That is really, really hard conversation in DC. And when I'd fight for it, and I would, it's funny. I remember one leader he goes, okay, well, if we give these units this extra predictability, we give them this a month of downtime. What do we want them to do during that month? I'm like, just leave them alone. These commanders know what to do. They know what they need to do to fix and prepare airplanes and prepare their crews. We don't need to tell them what to do. We just need to give them that predictability when we can. And we're really, really bad at doing that.
Yeah, that's tough. Predictability counts. So how, we have to wrap this up here soon, but if you were to take modernization dollars versus sustainment dollars and our readiness, be ready, because there's places we need to be able to fight tonight.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at balancing that? I mean, that's obviously a massive challenge, but with budgets remaining flatlined or even decreasing, we're making some big commitments. We've got the T-7s, the B-21s, now the F-47. We've got big space investments coming our way. We'll leave that out for you can bring it if you want for this discussion, but just on the Air Force side, tankers, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
How do you look at that?
You're going to have to, obviously the WSS, Weapon System Sustainment, is very expensive, and you have to look at platforms, and you have to actually reduce the number of fleets. I used to always say that there's a reason Southwest Airlines only flew 737s. It's really, really efficient when you got one sustainment line. Now, the Air Force can't just fly one type of airplane, but we don't need 4 types of bombers. And when I showed up at Z8, we were on the road to do that. We were bringing on the B-21. We had the B-2, the B-1, and the B-52. And we were actually going to have a bomber overlap for almost 10 years with 4 types of bombers. We just couldn't do it. And so we worked very closely with the Texas delegation to do an earlier retirement of the B-1 to make sure that we get from as quickly as possible down to a fleet of 2 bombers, which is a modified B-52 and a B-1. That kills an entire depot line. Huge vertical cut of the B-2 and the B-1. Same on the tanker side. This is why many aviators say, "Why did you retire the KC-10 so quickly?" It was a really expensive airplane. It was a very expensive contract logistics maintenance way we maintained it, and we had to get down to a 2 fleet tanker as quickly as possible to complete vertically cut part of that. Same with the fighters. We said at the time we had 7 distinct fleet of fighters. If you go a pre-block and post-block F-16s, the F-15CD, the F-15E, the A-10, the Raptor, and the Lightning. Well, we're moving to 4 fleets. The Raptor, then its replacement, NGAD, the F-35, the F-15 platform, 1 F-15, and then we call affordable mass, the F-16. Everything else needs to go. And that gets rid of some distinct depot lines, maintenance lines, parts lines, and that's how you actually reduce your amount of sustainment. And it's a really, really hard conversation, though, to have, not only with the delegations, certainly with the combatant commands. Try telling the people in CENTCOM you're getting rid of the A-10. We all love the A-10, but it's saved soldiers over the years. An amazing airplane, but we either modernize or we stop modernizing because we've got to reduce the numbers of fleets. If you look at the other air forces out there, the Australian Air Force has got two fleets. The RAF, the Brits have 2 fleets. The French are basically down to 1. The Marines are going to 1, the F-35, the B and C, so it's kind of 2. The Navy's going down to 2 fleets. The Air Force, we're sitting here with just too many fleets, and it's costing us too much money, weighing us down with WSS, and then not allowing us to modernize like we should, as quickly as we should.
Yeah, that's great. I know you'd put on track for that fleet future model. We'll see if it sticks.
That was just because we had some incredible leaders in the Air Force. I worked for Chief Goldfein and then Chief Brown, just unbelievable working for them. And they had, you come with them with ideas, and they had the juice to actually, take these things to the next level. And so,
because those are painful journeys.
Yeah, and they got some good ones up there right now too. Some good leaders up there right now too. That are certainly crossing that river to Capitol Hill and fighting a good fight when need be.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. Looking ahead, to like the 2030 timeframe, we're going to go 5 to 10 years. What single capability of innovation do you think will most dramatically transform how we project air power? And in that, what advice would you give to companies developing solutions in that space?
I think it's going to live. It's going to live in data. And I know that's not the fighter pilot answer. A bigger, better fighter. But it's unbelievable when you can get systems working together. When you can close, instead of closing dozens of kill chains, you can close hundreds, if not thousands, of kill chains inside a vulnerability period, inside of one stretch. I think that's when it's going to make a big difference. That's when legacy platforms like the B-52 and the F-15 are going to be working hand in hand with F-35s and NGAD and other advanced platforms. But it's going to be how we manage the data, and it's really, really hard because our systems weren't built. And the F-22 was built at a time we said don't talk to anybody, and now we want it to talk to everybody. And it's very expensive and very hard to do that. And you can multiply that out by so many capabilities we have in the Air Force. You see how much we have to do to overcome systems that don't talk to each other. It's kind of interesting too. I would say the airmen, everyone's so savvy in their lifestyle. They all got their cell phones. They're out there. They Uber Eats. They Uber here. They go. They check in for their flight to get to the airport. They are. Everything's all automated. Everything's done for them. And then they drive through the gate to work, and then they go back into the Stone Age. And it's just the way we're still trying to overcome that. Where the way the airmen live their day-to-day lives, we can actually translate that kind of life to the way they're actually fighting, when they're that connected. And I think we're getting close to being able to do that. And I think that's going to be game changing. I think these small companies, there's so many these capabilities. You and I were at that Tectonic Summit. Unbelievable. I mean, if anything renewed my faith in America was just seeing some of these small companies and what they're doing, what they're thinking, how smart they are. We in the Air Force and the military now just have to be smart enough to figure out how to integrate it and how to pay for it and how to bring it into the fold, because that's what's going to make the difference. We're going to set the tone. We're going to come up with the next big thing. I mean, China's playing around with advanced airplanes and some things. I'm like, we were doing that in the 90s. I mean, they're coming up with aircraft carriers now. I'm like, yeah, we did that in the 60s. I'm like, okay, the next big thing is going to come out of America, and I believe it's going to come out of some of these small companies. They're going to have these ideas. And we just got to be smart enough to figure out how to pay for it and figure out how to integrate it into our war fight.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Well, thank you, General Nahom. Obviously, you probably can't tell us what you're doing next. I know you're poking around, but look forward to that announcement. You're going to bring great value to whatever you end up doing, whatever perspective. But I really appreciate your time and a super enjoyable conversation. So I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Take care now.
All right. We'll see you later. Cheers.